Thanks for coming along to this session. The first thing I want to say is that this is very far from being my project. It's just my presentation. So this project was conceived long before I got involved in it. And the management data on which it is based was collected over many years, again, before my involvement. And even the research question was not one that I framed. It was one that managers in the reserves participating in the project came up with themselves. And broadly under the banner of GKEP, the Greater, it's that logo over there, the Greater Kruger Ecosystem Protection, Greater Kruger Environmental Protection Foundation. A phenomenal lady, Sharon over here, is the CEO of GKEP, and she coordinates collaborative operations between the different reserves in this landscape of the Greater Kruger in the northeast of the country. So I just wanted to make it clear that I just came on board as the data analyst, and I learned a lot coming in as a scientist and as a researcher from my interactions with managers. And as I said, the managers framed the questions, the managers decided how impact would be measured, and the managers decided what would be measured and how each of the interventions would be quantified. And even when I had completed the analysis and I went back to workshops with managers, managers contributed to the interpretation of the results, and in many cases corrected some misinterpretations I had made. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that what I've learned through this project is the power of collaboration between science and management. I know it's a rocky relationship often, but massive kudos to Sharon, who I highlighted earlier. She was like the knowledge broker. She was the go-between us as statisticians and scientists and the managers on the ground. Here's some of the other organizations. Rhino Recovery Fund funded this project along with support from WWF. Kruger National Park was a close partner involved in the project. Stephen Whitfield, who many of you probably know, one of the senior rangers at Kruger, was involved in conceiving this project together with Sharon. And I think what all the stakeholders in this landscape started realizing was that a lot had been done to try and stop rhino poaching, and everyone had been in crisis mode for a long time, but there wasn't enough time or headspace to start thinking strategically about what works, what actually works to reduce rhino poaching, what works the best, what works not so well. And it's a bit of an audacious question to ask, because you know better than I do that there's probably not a simple answer to this question. And so I made this title more to create interest. I don't know how well I'm going to answer this question. But enough caveats. Let's jump in. So I'm Tim. I'm from the University of Cape Town, and I'm a data analytics consultant as well. And I was very fortunate to be asked to help with this project. I want to acknowledge Professor Rez Altweg. There's a Center for Statistics in Ecology and Conservation at the University of Cape Town, and I've been working with him there. And then EJ, never miss an opportunity. Does anyone know EJ Milner-Gillen? Maybe not. I'm just interested in how well the science world knows the management world. She's a professor at Oxford University. I did my PhD under her, and she's a phenomenal mentor and a very big picture thinker. And without her support during my PhD, which I finished a few years ago, I don't think I would have been the scientist that was able to get involved in a project like this. So I'll give you a bit of background on the project, and then the methods, and then what I guess most of us are interested in, what are the results, and what the results do and do not mean, because it's very, there's uncertainty. When you do these kinds of analyses, there's no black and white answers, so it's important to interpret these results correctly, and that's where managers really were helpful, and intervention experts. Then we'll talk about, which I think is the most exciting part of all of this, is the high-level conclusions. What do these results mean for rhino conservation and counter-wildlife trade work more generally? And then some reflections on impact evaluation, if there's some time to talk about how does one do impact evaluation? How does one measure the impact of of your efforts. So I know many of you are EarthRanger users, protected area managers, people working for NGOs. All of us are involved in projects. How do we measure the impact of those projects? And how can we be sure that the impacts we see are due to our project and not to something else? It's a very difficult thing to get right. We don't have randomized control trials like they do when they're testing COVID vaccines. So again, the context, 10 reserves. It's actually 11. We included Karangani in Mozambique as well. So it's Kruger, the big government reserve, for those who don't know, state-managed reserve, the largest in South Africa. Manyeleti, one of the smaller reserves on the left there. All these reserves on the western boundary. Manyeleti is also provincially or state-managed. And then these are all private reserves. Are there any staff from any of these reserves? But how did each of these interventions affect poaching rates over time? So ideally, you have a few reserves that implemented certain interventions and others that didn't. Certain times when an intervention was implemented, so you have data before and after. It's a polygraph test on the bottom right, one of the more controversial interventions. So those are the data, the 11 different reserves. Karangani actually does not yet have a fully established resident rhino population, so we included it in the analyses of incursions, but not of poaching rates. That's the 11th reserve. But as you can see, some of the reserve population numbers, you can probably guess which one that is, up to 5,000 rhinos, other reserves, just 6. And the red bars indicate, as a proportion of all rhinos present, how many were poached in each year. So this is the variation in the data we're trying to explain with the interventions. Obviously, there'll be a lot more other than the interventions that explain these differences, and we try to account for that as well. I think I've made this point already. This actually came after we kind of were ready to release the public report, and then some of the stakeholders were not happy with the way the results were framed, and we went right back to the drawing board, and we had to take very seriously the interpretations of people working on the ground, and we kind of redid the whole report, and I think that maximized the insight. But what that showed me is that both these elements are limited. So data, we kind of like to think of data as completely objective and it's just the truth, but who collected the data, why did they collect the data, how did they collect it, does it measure the right thing, that kind of stuff. So there are limitations in statistical analyses, they don't just provide the truth. And managers can help complement the insights from statistics, but also sometimes managers' perceptions do need to be challenged with data. The world might not operate in the way that you think it's operating, and data and robust analysis helps with that. Don't worry about this graph, but it's more to make the point that it was very important to write down the hypotheses about how each intervention works, the pathway through which each intervention leads to a reduction in poaching, so that then we could test these hypotheses as opposed to just looking for patterns in the data and then trying to explain them afterwards. We generated these hypotheses. I say we, it was mostly the managers, through interviews with individual managers asking them, how does this intervention work? Why do you implement it? We came up with a schematic and we tested in the model. There were the two data collectors, Zianka and Zala. I think the managers wanted to run away when they saw them because they spent a year getting data from managers. They collected in my opinion, there was just way too much data rows in that data sheet. There was about 500 rows in one of the sheets, which was the security approach, which is like how many patrols do you go on, where do you go on, what kind of boots are the rangers using, and it was super detailed and useful information, but we ended up needing to really narrow down what the really key metrics were in terms of quantifying these interventions. So just to give you an example, for tracking dogs, it was something as simple as how many tracking dogs were present per 100 kilometers squared, how many detection dogs were present per commercial gate. You'll notice with those, if any of you have experience with canines, that might be an overly simplistic measure. There's nothing in there about the dog's ability or the handler's ability. Unfortunately, we didn't have standardized data to quantify everything that we wanted to. So some of these indexes are fairly simple. But a lot of workshops and thinking went into how we measure these. Just to clarify for those who may not be aware of integrity testing, it's because in this system a lot of the poaching incidents are linked to internal information where poaching has resulted because staff of the reserve have shared information with criminal syndicates, either about rhino presence or where interventions are, where rangers are, and so forth. So integrity testing is meant to identify people who are internally involved, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of legal ramifications there, but that's that. And some of the other ones are self-explanatory. So in a nutshell, this is what the statistical analyses did. For each reserve, we had quarterly poaching rates. We actually had monthly data. We aggregated to the quarterly level to ensure reliable assignment. And we can see that, for example, on this reserve, per quarter, 12% at one point of rhinos were being poached, which is a very high poaching rate, and that's gone right down. This reserve is slightly different, but the numbers are smaller in an absolute sense. And here we have the different interventions. So in this reserve, for example, that decline coincided with dehorning. But that would be a very poor conclusion to just look at one graph and say, poaching went down after dehorning on this reserve 1. Therefore, dehorning works. How do we know it wasn't something else? Maybe it was the COVID pandemic that led to that decline. And this is the real challenge with these kind of observational data. But the value of Project FIRE is that we have data before and after dehorning, but we actually have it on 5 different reserves that did dehorning. So that strengthens our conclusions. And often a manager's experiences from their reserve, but the value of combining data is to see, is what I've seen on my reserve consistently happening elsewhere? And if it isn't, maybe it's not working, as it's actually not this intervention that's leading to the change. You may be wrongly ascribing the change to the intervention. So again, I've labored this point enough, perhaps. It's a very complex environment to try and model. That's just the statistics. I won't go into too much detail there. But for those of you who are interested, there is a public report, and we are trying to publish this work in a scientific journal now. So this is a very somewhat esoteric statistical concept, but it's trying to account for variation in poaching that is not to do with your factor of interest, which is in this case is the interventions. So you're acknowledging that why poaching is high in some reserves compared to others is not entirely down to the interventions. It may be due to some other factor that you haven't measured. These random effects try and account for that by allowing the estimated poaching on a reserve to be boosted up or down. And therefore, the intervention effects are over and above these spatial and temporal patterns in poaching. So there's multiple ways we try to ensure that our analysis had something meaningful to say. So the results, less controversially, is just the cost. Amazing cost data. Just over R1 billion was spent on interventions. This is very much a minimum estimate for many of the specific aspects of interventions like detection zones. You don't really we couldn't quantify, how much staff time it took to go and check those zones. These are zones typically on the perimeter of the reserve, which are kind of maintained to detect poacher footprints as they cross it, like roads or rivers. So there were a lot of interventions we couldn't quantify the costs for. But as you can see, some were very expensive. Access control, that's staff, cameras, boom gates, that sort of thing. Air support, particularly on Kruger, an amazing air support service, and you'll see some of its success. And the specialized detection technologies on Kruger, some of you will know about, like wide area surveillance system and so forth. We decided to explicitly include security staff as a cost item, even though it's not technically a direct intervention. Oh, that's weird. I don't know if that's real water or some sound effect. Security staff are critical to each of these interventions. They don't just exist in a vacuum. There's people implementing these interventions. And as you can see, Kruger actually spent, although the overall expenditure on Kruger was higher than the private sector, the cost per rhino was much lower. So that just reflects, I think, perhaps the budget available to Kruger in terms of rhino protection is not so much in proportion with the number of rhinos there. So $76 million spent over a 5-year period. And it's probably closer to 100 million, to be honest. So what worked? Now, this is the slide where I tread very carefully. Does anyone have a glass of water? Sorry. Oh, thanks, Andrew. Okay, I appreciate it. Sorry, my throat's drying up. Thank you. I appreciate it. Sorry. Maybe it was the nervous gulp that stopped me on the slide. Because here's the answer to rhino conservation. Just dehorn all the rhinos. But that's kind of... So what these bars represent is that we're uncertain about the effect of each intervention. We don't. This is the range of possible values of the effect. So that's, on the left side, we have an effective intervention. If it's completely to the left side of this dotted line, that means the full range of our estimated impact of that intervention is negative, which means it reduces poaching. And we're pretty confident in this result. So, of course, with fence investment, it's kind of moving towards the left there. But what we do as statisticians is that we acknowledge that that relationship could have arose by chance. And so we only conclude that the effect is significant if the full confidence interval is to the left. Now, that might sound very technical, but the reasoning is very simple. We're guarding against false positives, concluding something's working when in fact it isn't. So we have a high bar for measuring success, which might explain why we were explanations is yes, they actually aren't associated with a big decline in poaching, those interventions. And we'll work through that narrative as we go along. So just to present the data in a different way, one way to explain these dots here is the slope of the line. The further to the left the dot is, the steeper the slope. So dehorning slope is a steep slope, and it's on the left, which means it's a negative slope. So as you dehorn more rhino, the annual poaching rate declines. And we estimated that for dehorning, that decline was an estimated 75% from pre-dehorning levels. So if you were losing 100 rhino, you'd be losing 25 after dehorning. That's an average effect across all the reserves and over time. And we do have evidence that some dehorned rhino were poached. Often it was after a period of regrowth. I was talking to someone from one of the reserves just this morning who said that they've recently re-dehorned their rhino. The reserves that do this maintain the dehorned state every 18 months max. They'll dehorn the rhinos again. But what these other results mean is that the relationship between each intervention, like camera tech and annual poaching, is flatter. As you invest more in that intervention, there's no clear reduction in poaching. Again, you have to be careful interpreting these results. It's a null effect. It doesn't mean cameras are useless. We'll see cameras led to lots of detections, but whether or not those detections actually led to reduced poaching is another story. So, tracking dogs. On this reserve, for example, again, you can probably guess which reserve it is. Which one am I looking for? This one. Dogs were deployed over 1,000 times. In a good number of those cases, they successfully led to an arrest. So dogs on that reserve led to hundreds of arrests. That's a good thing, right? So tracking dogs are successful. They're successful on many other reserves too. People, over 500 people have been arrested on Kruger. It's Kruger, I'm sure you knew. Thanks to the dogs. And then the challenge was not many reserves invested heavily in camera technology, at least not advanced camera technology, so it's difficult to quantify. But many reserves have cameras with AI, and many of them led to detections of poachers, and those detections directly led to a certain proportion of contacts and arrests. So I think I mentioned that headline result. So it's a proactive intervention. Most of the other interventions involve reacting once a poacher has already entered the reserve. This is a key one. And a lot of this is not my insight, it's the manager's insight. The internal information that facilitates poaching in this landscape, it's very hard to get around dehorning with internal information. There's not much that inside information can help you with, except to work positively. I think syndicates know very quickly when a reserve is dehorned. And they, it seems from our data, will then go and attempt poaching in a different reserve because the rewards are greater. But dehorned rhinos were occasionally poached. There's evidence that on one of the reserves, the manager told me that the weight of a rhino horn that had been poached, and they had caught the poacher and they retrieved the horn, was 5 kilograms, even though it was a dehorned rhino. One horn was 5 kilograms. I was amazed, and it was the stump of the horn of a massive male black rhino. So there's still value in a dehorned rhino to poachers. But the point is, I think, the value of that animal declines rapidly when it's dehorned, for the poachers, that is. This one, for those of you who are from KZN, is that where poachers have gone now? I know after this project, these are the 4 reserves that did total dehorning. Another 3 reserves in this landscape did dehorning after the project ended, and on all 3 of them, the data show the same pattern. But we didn't analyze it formally here. So now most of the reserves in that system are dehorned. It might make sense now for syndicates to shift elsewhere. But I like to use the analogy like, would you not put up a fence around your house because you're just diverting it elsewhere? You'd still put up the fence. Yeah. So we looked at the relationship between cost and effectiveness. Just in this very simplistic way, this axis shows the total amount invested in each intervention. As you can see, most of them had less than 2 million invested in the full project period. It was only a few. We didn't include security and some other things on here because we couldn't measure them directly. But as you can see, access control is an example of one that was very expensive but didn't have clear effectiveness. As dehorning, whilst being the most effective, also is relatively low cost, at least in comparison to some other ones. It's about 8,000 Rand per rhino in operational costs. So what do these results mean and do not mean? So again, dehorning is in this category of prevent. Before a poaching attempt is made, that's the level at which the intervention operates, so it's proactive. These ones operate after these detect interventions operate once someone has already decided to poach. And that might happen after a rhino has been poached, for example. But also, if there's no follow-up capability, those cameras can be very effectively detecting poachers. But if there's no follow-up, it won't lead to a reduction in poaching. And similarly, even if an arrest is achieved, unfortunately, the court systems in the system are not the most effective, and there's corruption within the court systems as well. So a successful arrest does not necessarily translate into less poaching. And there are many examples of repeat offenders. You'll get a link to the main report of these results at the end of this presentation. There's a lovely story that one of the managers wrote up about one particular poacher who was working for one of the reserves and then failed an integrity test, then got dismissed from the reserve, and then came back. He got out on bail and poached another rhino, and that rhino happened to be dehorned. So it was like a real interesting story about how these interventions actually work in practice. But the point is that if courts are ineffective, if sentences are not swift and fair and certain, they won't necessarily disincentivize repeated attempts. People who are arrested just go back. It's not everyone, but it is one of the loopholes with those kind of interventions. And I'm very aware that it's easy for me to say this as a scientist, but a lot of money and time has been invested in detecting and arresting poachers. And I'm not saying that that's useless. What I'm simply trying to highlight is that these can be done extremely effectively, and poaching can still carry on, which is really tough. So reduced poaching is a high bar of success. Many of these interventions may in fact have been effective, but the fact that there was internal involvement meant that we didn't see any effect in our statistical analyses. So ultimately, in the real world, they may have good in-principle effectiveness, they may be very logical, but if there's internal involvement, they just won't show out as effective. Again, that's beyond the control of managers. And indeed, in the illegal wildlife trade, a lot of what drives it and facilitates it, unfortunately, is out of the control of park management and way beyond the reach of technology. We're talking about things like corruption, socio-economic inequality, demand for horn, entrenched criminal syndicates. It's a wicked problem. So most interventions were reactive. These kind of reactive interventions have weaknesses. Sometimes they happen only after a rhino has been killed. Again, one of the senior rangers in Kruger said to me that he felt they were fighting the war like on the front lines, and that has a very high human cost, and on both sides. And so that's another weakness of these kind of reactive interventions. Again, they're not useless, but they do come with big costs. And they're weakened by other factors outside of their control, as we've already mentioned. So this point is what I've just made. These interventions are not addressing these big drivers of poaching and these big facilitators of poaching and, the ultimate driver of poaching. That's not to say that we shouldn't be implementing them, but it's important to be aware of these bigger things and not to measure yourselves too harshly, I guess, if you're seeing that your interventions are not being as effective as expected. It may be because of these external factors, which frankly are beyond the control of many reserves. And so I think ensuring more accountable governments, tackling socioeconomic inequality, these are the things that ultimately are required. We've said that already. Just some very quick reflections to finish off, allow some time for questions. When you're evaluating impact, say this was your rhino population over time. You started down there and it was increasing. Then you implemented a project like, let's say, dehorning. The rhino population increased afterwards. So this is what you observed today. After you've implemented your project, rhino populations have increased. But they were increasing anyway, right? So how do we know that it was the project that led to that increase? And this is the idea that you take the trend of the population in the direction it was going, and that's your counterfactual. That's what would have happened if you didn't implement the project. So you need to measure your impact against a robust counterfactual. That was really hard to do because this is the change in the rhino population that's not due to, from there to that line. That's not due to the project. It's only this change that's due to the project. So this is just to highlight some of the tricky, thorny issues. There's lots of ways you can do this. The gold standard is a randomized control trial. And as a typical naive scientist, I'm trying to promote more of these in conservation. I think someone from this morning in the cat world mentioned people in the control village who weren't getting the livestock protection treatments because they were in the control, suddenly wanted to be in the experimental group. And these are the problems with trying to do these randomized trials. But I do think that really is the gold standard if we want to measure whether things are effective or not. There's other methods we can use, statistical matching before, after control intervention. We were probably somewhere around here, so even the study is not a gold standard, if I'm honest. And the data are messy. But I do think hopefully I've convinced you that the conclusions are robust. Yeah, so I'll leave that up for a bit because you can access the full report just by scanning that QR code, but you can also just Google Greater Kruger Environmental Protection Foundation, and I think it's on their homepage, a link to the report. Yeah, and I do data analytics work if you want to get in touch, and if you want to keep the scientific article hopefully coming out later this year, you can get updates on it if you can email me or follow me on Twitter. But yeah, I must say through this whole experience I learned the limitations of science and the limitation of statistics, and that research is not the sole remit of scientists. Managers came up with this question. Managers interpreted the results. And managers showed insight that was way beyond my academic insight. So I think there's massive potential. And I'm here from the scientific community trying to promote more work with scientists. Yeah, so thanks very much. And I'm happy to answer some questions. Andrew. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I need a sip of that.
So excellent, Tim, and especially the point you made at the end there about scientists working with managers, because as someone who trains analysts a lot, that's one of our biggest things, right, is analysts get written off because they're not seen as being helpful. This is super helpful. So one, just from a crime theory perspective, this is a really good piece of evidence that opportunity reduction works, right? A criminal event involves a motivated offender taking a criminal opportunity to have a crime, and take that horn away. It doesn't matter how motivated you are or how much inside information you have, the opportunity, or at least the reward, goes down massively, and it seems to be something that works. So I think when you're writing it, if there's some sort of framing of how you want to talk about it from a criminology perspective, that's a really good one. Yeah. Also, you could include things like crime scripting, where there's this event that's happening over time, and what you're doing is the interventions are poking on that crime script from beginning to end, the preparation phase, where they're sourcing it. So I think let's definitely chat about that a bit, because I think there's a lot that you have here that when framed in a criminology perspective is fantastic, because you've got the stats, right? And now the framing is even just makes it stronger. The question, though, is you talked a little bit about this idea of displacement, right? Cut off the horns here, doesn't move there. Is that some of the follow-up research you're going to look at, that if there was evidence of displacement from one place to the next, because of course that greater Kruger area, there aren't fences between these reserves, and we know that when Kruger started shoring up its border with Mozambique, the first sign of displacement was it came to the western boundary, right, into the private reserve. So just the displacement question.
I'm glad you reminded me of that, and I'd love to chat about the framing. Just to say that is a question that came up a few times, and I literally ran out of time. And I would like to look at the data and see if it's possible, and within the system, but also maybe at least anecdotally between different systems in South Africa. So, and it's hard to say if it's just shifting from Kruger, say, to KZN and Tlhotloe and Mfolozi. Is that because of the dehorning or something else? But that displacement question is a really good one. Is it just displacing the poaching, or is it actually reducing overall poaching levels? Yeah.
Because the research on crime shows that displacement only happens in about a quarter of the events. So when we reduce opportunities, sometimes you get displacement 25% of the time, 50% of the time nothing happens, and the other 25%, you actually see the diffusion of benefits, where it goes down everywhere beyond your intervention zone. So I think you've got a really interesting data set to apply this.
Testing some of that theory.
Yeah. So thanks a lot, man. Beautiful presentation.
Of course. Thank you.
So just very interesting about the external factors and how they are more proactive. So community intervention, stuff like that. Is there interest in the community to look into that further and to see what impacts that could have on reduction in rhino poaching?
Yeah, a very good question. And in fact, not to do the project a disservice, they did have community interventions as a one to analyze, but it just turned out the data wasn't good, and the interventions weren't yet very strategic to combating wildlife trade. It was more like, employment and that sort of thing. But just to give you a picture, one of the reserves' ownership has been completely devolved to the local community. A lot of the reserves are very conscious of maintaining a good relationship with the local community, but I think, to be fair, there is a lot more that could be done, and I think certainly in this case it was crisis mode. We need to catch and stop the poachers, and I don't think the time and space to think about these longer term interventions, but I think this study does point to that. I'm not actually sure of the various projects the reserves are doing in the communities, but I know there is some work going on, and it's part of their philosophies. Yeah. Yes.
So I've got two questions. The one is about the data collection, and when looking at the scientist versus the manager, scientists always want more data, and the manager doesn't have time to collect data. Is there maybe a guideline out of this that you can say this is the ultimate collection, and really help the manager in that way, to say this is what we can use as statisticians to get valuable data out of it. And then the second question was, what is successful, how do you measure success of the intervention? And it seems like the killing of rhino, if it went up or down, versus is there any way to look at the success at conviction rate? Because dehorning will make it there's less being killed, but maybe with conviction, if you then look at access control at the gates, that might be even much more valuable if you use that data in the conviction side of it.
Yeah. No, those are two very good points. It's something I still need to deliver on this project. We kind of ran out of time. The data collection recommendations, and by and large, the big one is going to be we didn't need the amount of data that was actually collected, and we can actually simplify the metrics quite a lot. And I think we've learned a lot from this. And one of the managers, when I was sitting down with him, even suggested having a standardized monthly report that it's not some big thing you have to fill in at the end of the years or after 3 years. It's just something that's easy to complete. So I think that's more work needs to be done on that. On the success measures, ultimately the one we wanted to use was rhino population trends. Like that's the ultimate success measure. It's not just less rhino poached, but your population's recovering. But on a 5-year timescale, that was a bit hard. But to answer your question on measuring success by convictions, that is a valid success measure. And we tried to do that, for example, with arrests or detections by cameras. Those are legitimate measures of success. But we thought that those were just one step along the pathway towards reduced poaching. So if the access control is leading to a lot of convictions, but that's more convictions doesn't translate into less poaching, then we need to ask why that might be the case. But it's important to measure both. Oh, yes. Sure. It's a very good question. There was a recent paper released this year that some of you might know that showed that in KZN systems, was it KZN? Black rhino home ranges had reduced drastically after dehorning. I think what happens is, the hypothesis is that black rhinos become afraid of interacting socially once they've lost their horn, so they contract their home ranges. So that's an observed effect of dehorning. There's been some other work that quantified the difference in reproductive success of black rhinos in dehorned reserves versus non-dehorned reserves. The person who did that work is actually working with me now as one of my PhD students, and she found that there wasn't actually a significant difference in Namibia in the reproductive success of dehorned rhino versus not dehorned. But I think it's really an area of research that we actually don't know. So it's a bit of a risk what we're doing in dehorning rhino, because we don't know the complete social impact of that. But I guess people have accepted that risk because of the cost of rhino poaching. But I think more research is needed, and the PhD student I'm working with is working on that at the moment. Another one there. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Colette Blanche from Peace Parks Foundation. There was also, and I think it's out of that paper that was published in KZN, but there was also some findings which I understand has not been published yet, but looking at the behavioral patterns that have changed from dehorned black rhino after being dehorned, mating patterns and have changed. So that's quite interesting. And I think, obviously, as you said, I think more research has to go into what is the effects then of dehorning on the different on rhino. Yeah, just another thing on your study. It's super interesting and really needed. But so obviously we know now that dehorning has a huge effect. But obviously, dehorning on its own, I mean, there's all those measures. If you don't have proper access control, if you don't have proper fences, they all play a part. And together they make up, there's not just one, obviously, dehorning being the most effective, as you say, and your study that's shown. But obviously, there's a lot of other factors. I mean, the population has decreased drastically in Kruger, and hence it might be also that now dehorning, I mean, it's so, the poachers spend 2 days to find a rhino, so it might be also have an effect and not just dehorning. But obviously there's all those factors, fencing, having a canine unit, having effective field ranger patrols, having proper management that places the patrols and, oversees the operations also have an effect, and that together has an impact, not specifically dehorning. So how does that, that's also something that needs to be taken into consideration and not just looked at on its own, dehorning.
No, I think I probably don't need to add anything to that. I agree. And it was really hard to estimate what would have happened if all the other things weren't in place. So yes, dehorning had this massive effect, but we didn't have reserves that just had zero access control and zero ranges, and so we didn't know what would have happened if that were the case. And in this report, there's one narrative that I alluded to, and that narrative just shows that on one poaching incident, there were like 7 different interventions involved. And so I do think it's not just one answer. There is a mixture. But it's just that we can't say on the basis of these results that there was a clear, other than dehorning, a clear thing that's really working to guide managers to perhaps invest more in. We were just less certain about those other things. So it's not like we're saying they're not working. We're just saying we didn't find compelling evidence that this one is really a game changer. Dehorning was the only one. But you're right. Dehorning is a game changer. It doesn't mean the others aren't. And this is just Kruger. This is just one system. Maybe tracking dogs in another area where the courts are more effective and there's less socio-economic inequality, maybe the tracking dogs actually do translate into a huge amount of success. So, yeah. Yeah, sure. I know time is short. I'm happy to keep answering questions, but yeah.
Tim, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, fascinating. So just here's a question. So we did a study on about 35 different protected areas with black rhino over a course of 5 years, doing like strategic needs assessments there. And the key finding in that was the measure of success was directly related to the quality and integrity of senior leadership in the park. How does that fit in here?
Yeah, so this came up as well. How you deploy your canine units, how you conduct your integrity tests, where you put your cameras, how you motivate your ranger forces, all down to site level leadership and capacity. So we didn't quantify that. So I should have said perhaps that that's one of those things like COVID. Like COVID explains maybe differences over time, but management capacity and integrity would explain differences between sites. We thought of using I think it's MET, there's some tool recently, the provincial reserves in South Africa scored very low on their management effectiveness. We thought of using the scores from that assessment. But there wasn't enough variation in the data. A lot of these reserves are similar, private reserves, well-resourced. But I do think even in a well-resourced private reserve, when you're dealing with such specialist interventions, your management capability can. So maybe the fact that dogs didn't show up as effective in reducing poaching, they did definitely lead to arrests. I mean, possibly it's because of how they were deployed and the quality of the management team. So again, we didn't quantify that, and that probably is a big thing explaining differences. But again, I think that also explains maybe why dehorning worked, because when you dehorn, it's not like you can do a bad job of it. You either dehorn the rhino or you don't. And so regardless of your management capability, as long as you've got the money and resources to do it, it's not like your management expertise and integrity can compromise how well the rhino is dehorned. And maybe that explains partly why dehorning is so effective, because it's less down to human capability as long as you have a vet that knows what she or he's doing. Yeah. If people do want to leave, they can, but I'm very happy to keep answering questions. Yeah.
Was there any variation at all between Kruger and the private reserves? So like from state versus private?
Yeah. Oh, I don't have that plot. I thought I did. There's just a shot of all the collaborators. I don't. So what we saw is that Kruger was spending far less per rhino. Their resources were lower. And the population on Kruger did decline during the project period, but didn't decline on many of the private reserves. So reserve number 3, I'm sure Kruger doesn't mind sharing this, that's public available data, is that the population in Kruger has declined over time. Poaching has also declined, but the percentage of rhinos poached, at least until 2021, remains similar. But they've done massive dehorning. Maybe it's changed now, but on average, the private sectors, if you lumped all the private sector data, it was a flat line. The population has remained around 600, 700 rhinos. So yeah, there is a difference there. But there was no obvious difference. I mean, I think reserves that were losing rhinos were losing them for the same reason. Kruger wasn't doing a particularly bad job. The poaching rates as a proportion of the population was similar. Yeah. Is the next session at 2, I think. Maybe we should wrap it up there. Thanks, everyone.
It's right at the bottom here.